Breaking news. Prosecutors in Paris now say that there is a link between the gunmen currently involved in two separate standoffs. The suspects who killed 12 people at a satirical newspaper are surrounded. Then about 25 miles away, inside of a kosher market, officials say the man who killed a policewoman yesterday has now taken several people hostage. Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Kleffler in New York. French authorities now telling ABC News that the two hostage situations are in fact linked, saying that Sharif Kouachi, one of those two brothers that was on the run, who is in the hostage situation in the outskirts of Paris, and Ahmedi Koulibaly, both were tried for attempting to break a terrorist out of prison. We'll have the latest on both of those situations. Also, the possible threats here to the United States. I want to bring in our senior foreign affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, with more on this. And both of these hostage standoffs have, Martha, been going on for a while. Our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, as well, standing by. Martha, I want to start with you, though. These have been going on for a while. What's the latest on the situation with those two suspects?
Well, the two suspects have been surrounded for hours and hours, and obviously French police and the military are surrounding them. They've evacuated much of the area to keep civilians safe. They do have one hostage, but the police are moving very slowly. They're gathering any sort of information they can about that printing company where the two suspects and the hostage are now. They're trying to figure out what room they are in. They apparently do have some communication with those suspects. They're trying to bring this to a close. I suspect at some point they'll have to move in. They will advance on those suspects, but they want to go very slowly. They do not want that hostage harmed, so they are trying to keep things calm at this point. But basically, those two men have said they're willing to be so-called martyred. They are willing to die and not be taken by the police themselves. So it's a very difficult situation.
And Martha, as we've been pointing out, it has just been confirmed then to ABC News, in fact, that second situation, that there is a link between those men involved.
As you described there, Dan, that link, but we don't know why the other suspect took a hostage at that kosher market. We don't know exactly what he was involved in, if he was involved in the shooting of the female police officer yesterday. They suspect he was, but how those both played out, these hostage situations at the same time. With the two suspects, they actually were recognized by someone in northern Paris. They were recognized by someone where they are now and ran into that printing building and to take a hostage there.
Martha, we've been learning more about those Kouachi brothers, the two suspects that are holed up, that had planned that attack at the satirical newspaper. Then, what do we know about their training? What do we know about their backgrounds?
Well, first of all, what we do know and what we've been told by U.S. officials, and they are saying in France as well, is that the older brother actually received training in Yemen. And this is incredible, Dan, that he was not tracked after receiving training from al-Qaeda in Yemen in 2011. 2011, I was there in 2011 doing some reporting there. That is when the U.S. was looking for Anwar al-Awlaki, that American-born cleric who they say supported terrorists around the world. He supported the so-called underwear bomber, the printer bomber. They say he inspired the Fort Hood shooter. This was an intense time in Yemen, a magnet for terrorists, and they knew, the French authorities knew, and still do, and I think maybe tracked him for a short time, but apparently stopped tracking him. And I think they're going to have a lot of questions to answer because of that. Anwar al-Awlaki was eventually killed that year, September of 2011, by a U.S. drone strike. He was considered the most dangerous man in the world at that point.
Were either one of those brothers on the U.S. radar?
Yes, and I think, and Pierre can probably talk about this too, I think it's automatic. If you've been convicted of any sort of terrorism charge, or if they know that you were at a terrorist training camp, you're automatically going to get on a U.S. no-fly list. And both those brothers were, because the younger brother was convicted. He was on his way at one point to Syria to try to get into Iraq to fight against American forces there. He didn't make it. He was caught with several others who were getting recruits into Iraq. He had problems with the invasion of Iraq. He said he had problems with Abu Ghraib. I guess he'd seen those pictures, and that radicalized him as well, according to him.
And Martha, I understand, as you had pointed out there, that authorities right now are trying to have some kind of a negotiation with those two brothers. What do we know about the other situation, though, at that kosher market? Have authorities made any kind of a contact?
I think there's information coming out of there all the time that's changing all the time. I'm not sure whether they've made contact with the hostage taker. There had definitely been gunfire inside that market. There are reports that some people have been injured or killed, but that is still an ongoing and very fluid situation, Dan.
All right, I want to go over to Pierre Thomas then. Pierre, as Martha had pointed out there, obviously both of those brothers were on the concerns then of U.S. authorities.
Clearly, the U.S. government has been much more aggressive about tracking people that they believe have gone to various training camps. And as Martha said, anytime you're convicted of a terrorism-related crime, particularly in a country like France where we have deep lines of communication, that information would have been forwarded to the U.S. and they would have been put on this no-fly list. But I think, as Martha said, the key here is if that Yemen connection holds firm, a person who went there and trained with Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which is the most active terrorist organization probably on the planet other than ISIS at the moment, that would be a red flag to follow that person. And I can tell you that the U.S. government has been concerned about the kind of thing that you've seen play out in France all week, that people who had gone and trained would come back to Western countries and then be a problem, then attack on their own, either at the direction of a terrorist organization or just independently.
Pierre, I know that France had raised its terror alert level following these attacks. Then what's been the U.S. response?
Well, the U.S. response has been the consulates, French consulates, 10 of them in 10 cities around the United States. At least 4 have gotten stepped-up security. New York City, Atlanta, Boston, and Chicago, they've gotten stepped-up security. And in general, Homeland Security is monitoring the situation closely. They probably have done some things unseen at airports and places like that. But the main thing is that it reaffirms what they believe in terms of law enforcement, that you have a pool of people in the United States who could potentially do something. And what I mean by that, this year alone, the FBI has caught at least 12 people trying to go to Syria or Iraq to join ISIS, the people that are cutting off heads, going there, trying to get there. The FBI is very concerned that that tells you that there's a small population in the United States that identifies with these terrorists for whatever reason. So this kind of thing you see unfolding in France could unfold here. And if you recall the Boston Marathon bombing case of a couple years ago, it was precisely a situation where the alleged bombers had been radicalized on the internet, identified with, again, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, and conducted that attack.
Pierre, when authorities are trying to track these terrorists down, then must be a great degree of difficulty in looking at these sort of homegrown terrorists, these lone wolves.
Well, it's easier based on the evidence. And, for example, if they know someone has traveled to a terrorist training area, they typically will charge them with providing material support to terrorists. They don't have to have done an exact attack or anything, but they can simply say, you went and aligned yourself with a designated terrorist organization, so therefore we're charging you with supporting. Where it gets more difficult is if they are reading radical literature online. For example, the situation with the Zhanayev brothers in the Boston Marathon bombing case, he was on the FBI's radar. The Russians sent some information about him to the United States, the older brother in that case, but they didn't arrest him because they simply did not have enough evidence. He later went to Russia, came back home, and the attack against the Boston Marathon was conducted. That shows you that sometimes even when you have limited evidence, you can't move forward. But the key is that for the people that you know have gone to training grounds, you've got to be on top of those people.
And Martha, I want to ask you about then, sort of dovetailing off of what Pierre was talking about that right there, as far as U.S. officials monitoring people who go overseas or have ambitions to go overseas, get trained, and then come back, as far as the monitoring process, not only by U.S. officials, but to share with the international community.
I think they would share that. And obviously you can't sort of physically track a lot of people every single day, 24/7, but there are electronic means to do that. You can track their internet use, you can track their cell phone, and depending on where they were and what they did, the U.S. would prioritize those. There are, as Pierre said, all kinds of people who want to join jihad, go over there and say, you know, I want to fight for the cause, or they're lone wolves we may know nothing about, who are sitting in their basement right now planning some sort of attack, who had never been on the radar. But when you have someone who's actually gone to train, who's actually gone to Yemen or gone to Syria or gone to Iraq, wherever they received training, and then come back into the country or try to get back in the country, that should set off alarm bells all over the place in this country.
Martha, is there a distinction then, I mean, given the fact that we've had that prosecutor from Paris saying, in fact, that there is a connection between these two situations, though, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are simultaneous attacks?
No, and I think, as we were saying, Dan, I just don't think we know at this point why they're simultaneous, why it happened. I mean, with the two suspects, that certainly did not seem planned. I mean, they were basically caught. I don't know what happened with the other suspect, but they clearly know each other, according to the French officials. Whether there was actually a link of some sort with the massacre at the newspapers or the magazine's offices, we just don't know.
At this point, obviously, both of those situations still very fluid. Do we expect a further U.S. involvement in handling, in potentially negotiating either of those situations?
I don't think you'll see them negotiate. I mean, that the French will handle that. The U.S. will provide whatever help they're asked to provide, and I assume that is intelligence about these suspects and the third suspect in that second hostage event. But beyond that, I don't think you have U.S. people actually there. I know there's probably an FBI office in Paris, and they will provide any sort of help they can provide. But to actually be there on the ground right now, I have no information that says they are.
Pierre, what is the U.S. doing then as far as providing information or assistance then to French authorities?
The FBI has a Ligat office in Paris. The CIA, FBI, they also have ways to communicate with their counterparts. So there's information sharing going back and forth. And again, as Martha said, France is responsible for resolving the incidents there physically. The U.S. will give them whatever support they can in terms of information about the suspects that might inform whatever decisions that they have to make. But the primary thing that the U.S. government is doing right now is trying to get information and look at the threat picture here to see how they might upgrade security, and also give information to the French that might inform them about the men that are in custody. Right now, my sources are saying that there's no connections that they've uncovered so far between the men and the suspects in France and people here in the United States.
Our senior justice correspondent Pierre Thomas in Washington, and our chief foreign affairs correspondent Martha Raddatz. Both of you, thank you very much. Appreciate the updates on these very developing situations. And you can keep up to date with this story in real time by downloading the ABC News app and starring the story for exclusive updates on the go. For now, I'm Dan Kleffler in New York.